HWISE Now. Thank you so much for joining us today, panelists and participants. For those of you who are new to HWISE, this is a large, tight-knit, caring, and supportive collaboration that is currently funded by the National Science Foundation. We have been around in one form or another for about 5 years, and we nurture the values of collaboration, of doing good work that does good in the world, and that supports colleagues all over the world, no matter what incentives we're struggling with in our own universities and positions around research and publication and intervention. So that's something I've been really proud to be a part of as an executive committee member. We are led by Wendy Jepson, who claims to be lurking in the back, but is actually pulling the puppet strings. And so today our conversation is about a concept called moral economies. I'll start with a very brief summary about why I'm really excited about this concept, and then we will head into some logistics and the questions and conversation. Okay, so for people who know my work, you may know that a really central question that I've grappled with for a long time is why water sharing seems to lead to severe distress all around the world when, at least from anthropological theory, since I'm an anthropologist, it should produce happy feelings and be a sign that people are woven into a tight-knit functional social fabric. But for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be working that way. So part of my early training was understanding the work of E.P. Thompson and James Scott, and I thought that understanding this idea of a moral economy, including the right to survival and obligations of reciprocity, might be a model that could help me understand what was going wrong in how people enact water sharing. So my early work was in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Paul Trawick is an Andeanist who applied this idea of moral economies to water specifically and to Andean irrigation systems. So what I found in my own work, which was not in rural areas where this idea originated, but in peri-urban areas, was that the right to survival was very much upheld, but the obligations of reciprocity had given way to something that I called in my work an indiscriminate charity norm. And so basically people were not bound in dyadic obligatory relationships, but rather if somebody, it was basically like demand sharing. People had to give water to anybody who asked for it. And I sort of suggested that this might be driven by shifts like neoliberalism and market dominance in the water sector where I was working, or religious conversions and shifts from Catholicism to evangelical Christianity, or possibly urbanization. But basically, I felt like that was a very big agenda that I was probably going to be working on for the entirety of my career. Fast forward another 3 years, and Paul Trawick pops up with a pivot in his theory, which was originally received as sort of like a minor subvariant of ostromology. And in Wire's Water, he and his group argue that it is basically like the foundation to creating global sustainable water. And if everyone doesn't adopt a moral economy, it will never be sustainable. Right? So this was a very sort of brave and exciting proposition, which as far as I can tell, hardly anybody read. It's been cited fewer than 20 times. And again, sets out this huge, ambitious global agenda that's just sort of like waiting for people to step into. So that's very exciting. I think it could keep water scholars occupied for decades, but only if we come up with a shared understanding about what a moral economy is, since in my view, this is one of the most shockingly misused and misunderstood theoretical concepts I've ever encountered. So today we've gathered 3 world experts to disambiguate some of the wild debates and mistakes around moral economy, and to help us think how we as a scholarly community can move forward to theorize it and enact it. So before we begin, I'll start with some logistics. We're recording this event, as you can see. We'll host it on our HWISE YouTube channel after the talk. So you're being asked to turn off your video and audio as we chat, but I don't think they can have that on, right? And to use the Q&A to communicate with us, right? Is that right, Melissa? Yeah, okay. And so first, each of the panelists will introduce themselves. Then I have 10 questions that I prepared and they're aware of to guide the conversation. And then my hope is that if you have questions, you'll be sending them into the chat. And so then we can pivot to a more open discussion. it's probably worth saying that I think a number of us are excited about actually moving forward and collaborating on research around this. So if people are excited to get involved with that, those are the kinds of questions we'd love to start discussing here too. Email any of us if you'd like to get in touch with us after. And if you'd like to learn more about HWISE, you can visit hwise-rcn.org. So thank you so much for being here with us, and let's begin. Our panelists today are Dr. Melissa Beresford from San Jose State University in the United States, Dr. Georgina Drew at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and Dr. Dustin Garrick, now at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So will each of you in turn please tell us your name, your university, your title, your discipline, let us know who you are.
I'll lead off. Melissa Beresford. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at San Jose State University in California. I'm an economic anthropologist by training, and I focus a lot of my work on economic anthropology issues around water insecurity.
So I'm Georgina Drew. I'm an environmental anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Adelaide, which is in South Australia. I'm currently head of the department, and I'm also a senior lecturer here, which is sort of an advanced assistant professor in the system that we have. My past research has been regionally focused in India and Nepal, but I'm currently working on 2 sizable Australian Research Council grants for water and ecology related work in South Australia. One is on the hydrosocial adaptations to water risk in Australian agriculture, which is very topical with all the droughts that we've been having. And another is on the social and ecological drivers of marine conservation, which is a new interdisciplinary project that looks at reef restoration practices alongside the social licensing of those endeavors.
Hello, everyone, and I'm Dustin Garrick. I'm an associate professor based at the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. I'm also a fellow and part of the teaching team at the University of Oxford in its School of Geography and the Environment, where I've been teaching for the better part of the last 10 years. I have a PhD in geography and a focus on collective action, institutions, and property rights, particularly within a long-term program of research examining the evolution of water and environmental markets, rooted in the tradition of institutional analysis. I wouldn't call myself an ostromologist, Amber, but I have been working in that tradition of institutional economics, where some of the concepts and themes in moral economy have a kind of corollary or kindred perspectives that I hope to engage in today. And I should mention at the outset that to some degree, I put the imposter and imposter syndrome in this discussion of moral economies, in the sense that I don't invoke and use that term directly, but I am engaging with themes around pro-sociality and alternative perspectives and conceptions of markets and institutions. So an opportunity for us to kind of engage and learn across these traditions and perspectives. So thanks again for involving me.
Thank you so much. And to Dustin's point, if we are going to broaden the uptake of this concept, then we do need to think about how to talk about it to other audiences. So that's a great and important contribution. Okay, so I have alluded to the shocking misuses of this concept, and I wanted to kick off with the question, please tell us one common misconception about moral economies. What are they not? Gina, do you have?
All right. It's a good provocation to start with, for sure. So I think that you're very right, Amber, when you were saying earlier, perhaps before the recording started, that there's a lot of different views on this. And from my perspective at this point, it's basically still subjective. So from my perspective, one major misconception, or at least my view on the misconception about moral economies, is that they imply the allocation of equal shares or the even allocation of goods or resources to whatever population is being examined or studied. So I do get a sense of this from some of the work that's out there from early on. So earlier, I think pre-recording, there was a mention of Paul Trawick's work. So he's a 2001 American anthropologist piece on the moral economy of water, equity and antiquity in the Andean Commons. And so the idea around that is kind of looking at historical water management systems, but then how there was a fair and just even allocation of water that created for him a moral economy. However, he doesn't do a lot of theorizing around moral economy in that piece. although Amber was mentioning that there is a Wires Water piece that's a follow-up to that, which we can all look at for more guidance on his update. But based on my research, it's not my experience that the moral economy in places of significant water stress requires even allocation. So to foreshadow some of my thoughts on the other questions that we've been given, where I think Trawick's work is a bit closer is the emphasis he makes on how fair perceptions of water use allocations impact social solidarity and cooperation. Those are key terms that he uses. But saying that, I don't necessarily think that the moral economy is about creating social or economic utopias either. So those are some of my misconceptions that I would point out.
Melissa, what misconceptions would you point out?
Sure. So I'll back up for a minute and broaden out and just, remind everybody that the moral economy concept, we're talking about moral economy as it applies to water and water insecurity, but it's much broader than that in the way that it was originally conceptualized. And so oftentimes, if you Google Scholar moral economy, I mean, there are just thousands of uses of the term in the academic literature. And oftentimes people will use the term moral economy to describe the interface of morality and human economic life. So instances like charity work or corporate social responsibility will get termed moral economy. But if we're talking about the way that E.P. Thompson and James Scott operationalize the concept in their work, it's really about more than that. I think that Kate Brown wrote an excellent article about economics and morality several years ago, in which she points out that economic systems in general all reflect moral issues. So even if we're talking about neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism and neoliberal economic reforms reflect a specific morality. It's still an interface of morality and economic systems. So if we define moral economies as that, then that literally makes every economy a moral economy, and then the concept becomes useless. So I don't want to go too far into what moral economies are, but I will just say that moral economies are not just this interface of morality and economy. It's more than that.
Dustin.
Okay, and with the humility and the context of the answers that have come before, I suppose my perspective would be that a moral economy is not the only branch of economic thinking concerned with issues of equity, fairness, and justice. And one of the footnotes I can offer to my kind of disciplinary affiliation is that when Amber asked us to identify our discipline, it filled me with kind of an existential dread, in the sense that I'm trained in geography, my PhD, but degrees in political science and public administration. And ever since finishing my PhD and doing a Fulbright in Australia, where I had been publishing on institutions and markets, I was mistaken as an economist. And over time, I've kind of embraced a double agent role where to non-disciplinary economists, I am just assumed to be a conventional economist. And I say that, Melissa, because in your work on embedded economies, you cite me as a conventional economist, which is an interesting moment. But to economists, I'm rarely tolerated, if anything, kind of assumed to be on the fringes of the discipline. And one of my projects has been to act as something of a Trojan horse within the discipline of economics, to remind economists of this really deep and long tradition of concern with moral and ethical positions and normative perspectives. So much so that in our paper on the Oxford Review of Economic Policy on the economics of water, the real headline was that the economics of water cannot be understood without attention to issues of equity and justice. And that to me seemed like a real triumph. But the point being is that moral economies are not the only branch of economic thinking where these concerns have come up. Institutional economics, where I focus on working rules and norms that structure economic behavior and collective action, issues of equity, perceptions of fairness are really central to the explanations and theories in that tradition. And I think one of the exciting projects that come with our efforts to advance discussions of moral economy is to remind economists that they can build really at the root of modern economics. And Adam Smith's work on moral sentiments as a basis for reactivating and elevating the role of fairness and equity in these issues, and a few other aspects that I'll leave for later in the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, so now the most exciting question of all. How do you define moral economy in your own work? And so I think I will start again with Gina and follow the same order.
Okay. I have a relatively short answer for this, and as I'll speak to later, it really derives from some of the reading of a few select scholars that I'll mention at a different point, but also from the social movement activists that I've been working with, particularly in India, relating to a piece of work that I just published. But in that piece, which I'll elaborate on later, I define a moral economy as a subsistence-focused morality of water rights. In the way I've spoken about the moral economy of water, people or companies are allowed to profit from water use and from the sale of water up until the point when someone else's profit comes at the expense of another person's access to their base water entitlements. So when taking this approach, I focus on the discourses, semiotics, and knowledge practices that people and activists produce about the just use and allocation of water. I've also emphasized how discourses and knowledge practices are used to spark and sustain collective action to repair unjust, imbalanced, and immoral water use practices. And this nod towards collective action is also in a lot of the scholarship on how you see and know when a moral economy is starting to happen, particularly when they're imbalanced, you see collective action to improve it. But the definitions of what's imbalanced and what level of morality comes into play, I think, it varies and is contingent on the region that you're looking in.
And it's like minimally a 10-year research agenda just to engage with that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Melissa.
Gina, thank you so much, because that tees up my definition so beautifully in talking about the way that moral economies, you can see them as being kind of balanced or unbalanced. So I will say that I define a balanced moral economy, that's functioning well, as having three fundamental elements. First, a collective or shared notion of a moral right to survival, right? Of a moral understanding of a basic subsistence, and that everybody has a right to that basic subsistence. Second would be normative economic practices within the community that serve to uphold that right. So basically, when somebody's subsistence needs are not being met, there's some sort of economic actions taken within the community to ensure that they get that subsistence that they need. And then third are mechanisms of social pressure within the community to make sure that those practices persist, right? And this is where that balance piece really comes in, because if people are not enacting those practices to meet people's subsistence needs, then there needs to be that social pressure mechanism to make sure that it happens and that people don't essentially free ride or step out of their responsibilities to provide the subsistence within the economy. So those mechanisms of social pressure, we can talk later in the discussion, I think can happen in many different ways. But really it's those three pieces that create a functioning, balanced moral economy.
Thank you.
Well, I will, add three considerations here. The first point is to the obvious that the answer is that I don't directly use the term moral economy in my work, but I have used terms related to equity and fairness and focused on how moral and ethical concerns have shaped the evolution of water markets. Most importantly, in my early work, I opened the black box of what are described as transaction costs. Described as the economic equivalent of friction associated with defining and transferring property rights. These costs, which are often assumed to be negligible or zero in economic models, ultimately arise from distributional conflicts and other valuation disputes, which may be seen as a process of trying to balance or rebalance in the ways that have been described in Melissa and Georgina's work. And I see that as a new entrant to this discussion, that transaction costs are proof of the enduring salience of moral economies and conflicts over resources and rights. And looking forward, as I engage in this discussion and some broader work, I have become interested in defining moral economy in terms of the focus on how market integration, this process of agrarian transitions and other kinds of changes from subsistence to alternative forms of economies have impacted on different measures of pro-sociality, taking the work on moral economy from Samuel Bowles, which has been focusing on the concept of social preferences and how our models of human decision-making really deviate from the kind of standard assumption of homo economicus, of this kind of selfish actor, and focusing particularly on how our markets teach us to act selfishly rather than reward or nourish our other regarding preferences, our notions of fairness, equity, and so forth. So I think the concept of pro-sociality and the really exciting work on the effects of markets on motivational crowding is one area and space where we can explore these processes of balancing. And I have one final point, but I'll stop there and bring it into the discussion a little bit later on.
Thank you. We have one last definitional question that hopefully we can kick through. And then I see that our collaborator and dear friend, Diana Lambrini-Dow, is asking us to bring real world examples. And so then the next question will be designed to walk through real world examples from each of our scholars' work. Okay, so last definitional question. How is a moral economy different from a human right to water? Gina, I'm starting with you.
Sure. I have an even shorter response to this one, particularly because I think that there's a lot of room for debate around this. So my take on it is that a moral economy doesn't deny that there's a human right to water. The morality of water rights is implied in both frameworks. In a moral economy, however, the emphasis is on people receiving the base amount of water needed to be able to flourish without taking away someone else's ability to do the same. Where this becomes imbalanced, such as in zero-sum game approach of I take and you lose, then we see the kind of discourses and appeals that we might associate with claims for a more moral economy.
Thank you. Melissa?
So this question was a little tricky because there's scholars that have written so wonderfully with critiques on the human right to water, and I feel like a lot of those critiques really are so excellent and play into this. So really the difference that I see is that if we're talking about the legal definition of like the human right to water as a Western legal institution, right? There's a lot of different ways to interpret that still allows the human right to water to be supposedly upheld, but moral economies to still not be in place and people's sense of justice and morality to still be undermined, right? So they may be getting water according to a human right to water, but they still have a deeply undermined sense of justice. So an example of this would be all of the writing that people have done on prepaid water meters in South Africa, for example. So prepaid water meters in South Africa were designed to give people a basic level of water. South Africa is one of the countries in the world that adopted a human right to water within their constitution. So these water meters gave people a basic level of water and then cut people off if they didn't pay for water after that, okay? So technically their human right to water was being met under the legal definition, but it deeply undermined their sense of dignity and justice because their water was shut off mid-month, not being able to give water to bathe their kids, to cook their food. So that's an instance where we can see a major difference. I think to sum it up, I would say that a human right to water is really a top-down institution, whereas a moral economy to water is really more of a normative ground-up understanding of justice. So I think that might be a basic way to describe the difference between the two.
Thank you. Melissa, if you feel comfortable, could you just maybe like slightly unpack there at the end what you said, which I completely agree with, about the role of elites in the two concepts?
So I think that the role in a human right to water, that definition has been constructed by elites, right? And the notions of justice within a human right to water have been constructed by elites in a very top-down way, written into legal definitions and codes, which are normally constructed by elites. Whereas a moral economy is a normative economic institution. So it's a cultural understanding among people that is developed within the community, right? So it's working from the ground up. So it's using collective action and collective notions of morality to put pressure on elites to demand the things that people want.
Thank you.
People need, I should say, not want.
Can I just add that that's beautifully articulated, Melissa? I really appreciate that. So I'm going to be going back to the recording to write out what you just said. The other thing I think is in the quantitative measures that these elites are producing in terms of the 35 liters per person per day or whatever the number is as like a base right and entitlement. That's also, it's a different situation when you look in context in situ in different regions of the world, and whether or not that holds up as a true culturally valid right that people accept, and that we can have discussions about those quantitative measures as well. But I think that's also the difference between a white human right to water, the way that it's defined and mandated and articulated, versus this moral economy approach.
Yeah, 100%.
So I hope this conversation really makes clear to the participants who were excited to hear from why we think this concept is so exciting and has so much potential. Dustin, can you share with us any thoughts about how a moral economy is different from human rights water?
There's no following that, Amber. I'm sorry. I mean, it's just the bookends of Georgina's and Melissa's answers were ideal. So I'll defer to those, but I think it also, in Melissa's insights, kind of points us into future discussions and connections with the institutional economic literature and in terms of the governance arrangements and the relationship between kind of grounded community level decision-making and processes and what's happening outside, and in terms of external governments and how they can impose standards, processes, values on local groups. And so I am learning from the insights from Georgina and Melissa where some of those intersection points might lie.
Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to get to a very in-depth question that I think also sort of builds off of Jana's question about hearing about real-world examples of balanced or robust moral economy. So the question that I have for our panelists is, please walk us through an example of a study in which you researched moral economies and water insecurity. So what was the setting and how did you choose the research sites? What aspect of water insecurity were you focused on? Walk us through how you collected and analyzed the data, and what was your key finding about moral economies and water insecurity. And so sort of the inspiration of this question is not only to make these ideas that we've been discussing concrete, but also to give an opening to the participants if they're thinking about beginning to explore this kind of research question, how, what are different ways to enter into it. So Gina has published a fantastic 2021 article on this topic that everyone should read. And so I will call on you first.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I'm glad we get to run through all the subcategories of this question too, because I think there's a lot to unpack in the example that is that comes up with my latest piece of work. So I do use a moral economy framework in an article with South Asia, the Journal of South Asian Studies, which is a fantastic journal for anyone that is looking for South Asia content, but also for critical thinking on things that are happening in the subcontinent. But that article is on Coca-Cola and the moral economy of rural development in India. So that text is the result of over a decade and a half of me following the efforts of a village level social movement to stop the operations of an Indian-owned subsidiary of the Coca-Cola company in a rural town called Mediganj in Uttar Pradesh, which is in a location not far from Benares or Varanasi. Some of you might have heard of that town before, or that historically the world's oldest living inhabited city. I first learned of the movement in 2004 when I was working for the International Forum on Globalization in San Francisco as an intern and a master's student looking to apply my research and my interest in the real world. And at the time, the village that I went on to study was not in the international limelight per se, but a major battle against a similar bottling plant was brewing in the South Indian state of Kerala. Some of you might have heard of the Plachimada movement against Coca-Cola. So that fight was led by low-income and tribal activists, many of them women, and they were ultimately successful. They had 100+ days of sit-ins at the gates of the factory, and it was ultimately shut down because of the water over-extraction practices that were alleged to be taking place. I'm going to use the word alleged quite a lot in speaking about this case for reasons you might imagine. So when I first started working with activists in Mediganj, they were in the early stages of self-organization and were linked with a wider national movement such as the Lok Samiti or the People's Committee. There's different branches around India, and the National Alliance of People's Movement, which is a huge umbrella organization for social movements around India and elsewhere. So the people I was working with were concerned about their falling groundwater levels, and they were also concerned with what they said was the contamination of their crops due to the release of sludge that came from the factory, either accidentally or intentionally, and that's a different story. So in terms of the kind of water insecurity that I focused on, even though Mediganj is just a dozen or so miles away from the banks of the Ganga, the region sits within regularly faces droughts that are, and there's a relatively high density of small scale agriculturalists. And the streams and rivulets nearby mostly flow only during the rains, and much of the agriculture relies on groundwater. However, due to a variety of colonial legal legacies, it used to be that if you owned land, if you owned a plot of land, you were entitled to all the water that was underneath your land that you could extract underneath it. What these older laws didn't take into account, however, was the potential for new technologies to one day be able to drill deep into the ground with numerous bore wells powered by diesel generators operating at all days of the night. Or in the case of a bottling plant, 4 to 5 massive bore wells with each their own massive generator and an endless supply of diesel to keep them powered and extracting water. So this was the context for the fight between Mediganj activists and the bottling plant in their backyard. They claimed that the bottling plant was effectively sucking the ground dry, leaving very little for villagers to use in their agricultural fields. These villagers were already extremely low income, many operating hand to mouth to provide for their families. And since the factory gates and the walls carried the Coca-Cola branding, the inequity of the situation was not lost on them. They were bitter that a subsidiary of a multinational company was able to make major profits while paying just a few rupees per liter, and I think it might even have been less than a rupee per liter, for the water coming out of the ground. So in terms of the data that I collected and analyzed, when I was in country, my primary method was to speak with villagers and activists about their struggles when I visited Mediganj. I'm an anthropologist, so that's what we do. We talk to people in situ. This involved going to campaigns, to rallies, to sit-ins, and to meetings regionally organized and in New Delhi. I went to basically places wherever there were concerns about these villagers that were being discussed or about the role of major multinational companies in India. I was traveling around over this decade and a half while doing other work as well, but following this movement, dropping in occasionally, coming back, etc. I also collected the materials produced by the movement activists themselves, including their pamphlets and booklets. And to my surprise, a key source of content that went on to be featured in the article I mentioned earlier was the poignantly worded songs and slogans used in the rallies and sit-ins that I observed. These songs and slogans contain irony, wit, sarcasm, anger, and even instructions on how and why to organize against a multinational company with roots in imperial nuke blasting America. These things come up later. When I was out of country, my secondary method was to absorb as much of the news and social media content as I could about the actions and the progress of the campaign. I also made friends with several of the activists, and one in particular, along with his wife. We still email, do the occasional Skype call, and I get all the updates on what their activist organization is doing, and they continue to be active in the region. So in terms about my key findings about moral economies and water insecurity, the first thing to say is that the villagers in Mediganj were not against Coca-Cola per se. Several of the activists said that they were excited when they first learned that a subsidiary of an international company was coming to set up shop in their town. The news came with hopes of employment for villagers and for what we might call the trickle-down economic benefits of having a major company in their backyard. Again, keep in mind, these are very low-income inhabitants of a rural area, and they were seeing, particularly when this was all happening in the turn of the 21st century, they were seeing this major company as a sign of hope for the development, the industrialization, and the benefits of globalization to come that they'd been promised in the news and elsewhere. The villagers, however, were slowly let down when the company began to hire from neighboring villages, not their own. And these neighboring villages were far enough away so that the workers from those villages, their groundwater wasn't being affected, and they were being employed in the factory and shipped in. Even when they hired within the village, the activists alleged that the company mostly hired from a single subcaste. So these hiring practices meant that out-of-towners had little incentive to strike, and the in-towners were bound by caste solidarity, at least ostensibly, to protect their income generation. After a couple of years, the groundwater dropped and the alleged dumping practices began. The activists had the sludge tested, and they allege that it contained cadmium, chromium, and lead, which are baddies when it comes to things you don't want in your body, endocrine disruptors, carcinogens, the whole deal. Women, they said, who tended the fields that had been contaminated by the sludge developed rashes, stomach aches, and some were reportedly, they went on to have reproductive problems and miscarriages. It was around this time that the claims about the perceived immorality of the bottling plant arose. So in my article, I include an image from the cover of one of the activist book lists that speak to this. It's right here, but I'm not going to show it because it does have some insignias that I would rather not have a copyright infringement for. But the cover contains a hand-drawn image showing a woman in a sari with a child at her side, unsuccessfully attempting to get water from a dry hand pump. In the illustration, sweat pours from the woman's head as she looks up at a plane dragging a promotional banner that reads, "Thirsty? Drink Coke." Next to the image is a red ink mark of a rubber stamp common to official documents in India that states, "Coca-Cola, we are sorry, but this company is ethically out of order." And these are on all caps, out of order. The company is ethically out of order. So as I explain in the article, this creative use of an official stamp is a symbolic and discursive effort to pass a moral verdict on the bottling plant and its parent company. I'll leave it there. There's more to say, but that's the context for where I jumped into this piece of work and what I was starting to extract, and I'll return back to some of it in a later question.
Thanks, Tina. Melissa, you ready?
Sure. So the project that I want to describe is actually, it's a little funny because the publication is a paper that Amber and I published together, our 2016 paper in World Development on informal water vendors in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And we didn't actually apply a moral economy model in the paper, but I'll kind of explain how we went through it and how it was really when we were doing the final revisions of that paper that I realized that there was a moral economy going on there, which kind of inspired a lot of my own curiosities to do more research on moral economies. So just as a bit of background, as many people who are in this Zoom room right now know, people who are not connected to municipal water supplies, millions of people around the world are forced to rely on water vendors to access their water. Vended water is shown to be 4 to 30 times the cost of municipal water. And so typically water vendors are seen as kind of these opportunistic exploiters of people trying to sell water to make a profit off of people's desperation. So we really wanted to know going into this paper how water vendors might be upholding, whether or not they might be upholding a human right to water and a sense of justice and dignity. And so we, with a Bolivian colleague of ours, Cynthia Carvajal, interviewed both residents in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and vendors about their notions of justice around water. We interviewed them around their notions of justice to water and how these water vending institutions operated, and basically how vendors' senses of justice and client senses of justice might align or misalign. So that was really the goal of the paper. What we did in our findings, so we analyzed the findings, it was interviews, we analyzed the interviews thematically according to an institutional framework to kind of understand the rules and norms that enabled these water vending markets to operate. And we found that all vendors and their clients really shared a notion of a moral notion and a right to water, right? People said stuff like, water is life, everybody has a right to live. So there was absolutely this shared sense of justice around that everybody should be able to access water. That being said, clients oftentimes felt a lot of, there was a lot of injustice perpetuated by water vendors because they would have inconsistent delivery schedules, they wouldn't deliver water on time, or they may not have the money to buy water, and so they felt that their justice was being undermined. But we actually found that a lot of water vendors worked with one another. So especially these were vendors that unionized. So they unionized and they worked with one another to really try to keep their prices low. So they told us water is life. We are really fighting for everybody to be able to access water within the community. So they would meet with one another to try to make sure that they could keep their prices as low as possible. They would try to organize their delivery schedules. And the other thing that was really interesting that they did is that they gave regular clients that bought from them regularly, free gifts of water that are known as yapa. And this lowered the cost of water for clients, right? So vendors, of course, were members of the community. So they lived in the communities as well. And this was the way that they made their living. So they couldn't just give water to people, you know, for free, even if they wanted to, because they had to be able to make a living. But they really tried to make sure that they weren't exploiting or profiting off of their neighbors and their community members. So it was really in the revisions of this paper that I realized, well, this is actually a moral economy model that is happening within a market institution, right? So we have a shared sense of justice. We have norms of, okay, if people are in need of water, vendors tried to do things like giving people water on credit, giving people gifts of free water, right, to allow them to access it. And the mechanisms of social pressure that made this happen was really the union, the water vendors union, in the way that they organized, because they were kind of keeping check on one another to make sure that they were all following the norms that they had put in place. On the other hand, there were a group of vendors, of non-unionized vendors, they were known as pirate vendors, who operated outside of these institutions independently. And they were less likely to give those gifts of free water. They would have inconsistent delivery schedules. And they were really the ones that we think were the kind of root cause of that injustice that clients were feeling. But of course, clients didn't know who were unionized vendors and who were non-unionized vendors. So they tended to see all vendors as perpetuating this sense of injustice. So the moral economy was kind of operating there. We recommended in the paper that these institutions could be operating more strongly if there was communication between vendors and clients knew the institutions that vendors were trying to put in place, and clients were able to have their voices and concerns heard by the vendors. So again, although we don't write about it as a moral economy in the paper, it really was a moral economy model that I think is a really interesting model to consider, since there's not, and I can talk about this more later, but there's really not a lot of moral economy work that's done within markets. Most moral economy work to date has really been looking at reciprocity-based institutions and not at market-based institutions.
Thanks. Dustin?
That's really brilliant in terms of a point of departure, or my entry point rather, in terms of this discussion, where the broad question motivating my work on the evolution of markets has been whether people and communities can use markets without being abused by them, to paraphrase the economic historian Tina Demore. And I think that kind of corresponds with Georgina's definition or notion of moral economy, and one which it kind of maintains or sustains subsistence economies and livelihood opportunities within these processes of market integration of different forms. So with that in mind, my response to this question, like all of them, is a bit different, in the sense that my most important observations about moral economies have been incidental or accidental to other projects, and very much the motivation for engaging in these discussions, to learn from a moral economy model of how we would answer the question that I've just posed. But with that said, I can offer three of those observations to illustrate why the moral economy model is so appealing to me, and also where it intersects with some of the exciting developments within other branches of economic thinking, including institutional and behavioral economics. So my research program now is a comparative research program on the evolution of markets, and working in 8 different countries, from Mexico to China. But my origin story and start was in Western North America, and then recently after that in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin. And these 3 observations I think illustrate a neglected aspect of the experiences with the market-oriented reforms, which in those contexts were addressing challenges of water insecurity associated with semi-arid, irrigation-dominated regions starting to encounter the effects of drought, climate change, and competing demands from neglected or emerging uses and values associated with indigenous peoples, with the growth of cities, with environmental flows. And the Murray-Darling, where I've worked since 2007, Markets have been used to buy back water from irrigators to restore wetlands and other environmental values. And the use of markets to buy water from farmers has apparently reduced the willingness of farmers to donate a portion of their water for river restoration when surveyed in repeat surveys 10 years apart, in part because the market created an opportunity costs and basically an incentive for the farmers to sell that water. And so their willingness to donate it because of a sense of the viability and sustainability and let's say the justice concerns in their communities was overwhelmed by these new incentives. And so this has also within the Murray-Darling fueled a sophistication and transformation of large groups of irrigators into savvy agents within a cap and trade market model. They've been essentially trained and disciplined by the market in a way that people like Samuel Bowles and his work reviewing the behavioral economics literature has demonstrated a process of informing or learning preferences such that people now prioritize their selfish instincts over their concern for others. The second observation and story is based in the Columbia River Basin, where I've worked since 2006, and this is in the Pacific Northwest, US and Canada, although my work is focused primarily on the US portion of the basin, where again, markets and water transactions have been used to reallocate water through purchases or leases from farmers to restore habitat for salmon fisheries. And in this work, as in most of my work, I combine qualitative and quantitative techniques and tried to open up that black box of transaction costs by developing forensic accounting tools to measure the cost of doing transactions within these markets. And now have conducted 4 repeat studies starting in 2006 and underway and ongoing now to look at the long-term evolution of the market in terms of these transaction costs and what drives them. And despite the kind of predictions of economic models that these markets would create incentives to reduce the transaction costs to become more efficient, they've been stubbornly high. And in some of the subbasins, prohibitively so, or even restricting any of the transactions. And when probed in terms of why these transaction costs remain so high, the answers can cluster around issues of cultural resistance and concern for members of communities. And so the places which have been the relatively effective in terms of using markets to restore water for rivers have had the markets go hand in hand with community level and other collaborative governance processes, which kind of give voice and some sort of control over this process of market integration. And then the final observation actually was inspired by reading Melissa Amber's work on informal water vending in Cochabamba and some more recent work, a pilot study that we've done in Northwest Kenya, which is designed to develop methods for high frequency monitoring of vending networks in places like Cochabamba and other parts of the world, which rely on vended water to address gaps, reliability, failures, and the extension of piped water systems. And very much interested in understanding the role of norms and different forms of collective action cooperation in terms of these markets providing viable options for water supply. And I won't talk about that in too much detail now, because I want to leave some space for the kind of future-oriented research. But these observations have motivated work now where I see the real need to combine experimental and ethnographic methods across multiple sites for us to understand the long-term effects of market integration on different measures of pro-sociality. And I'll unpack that a little bit and with the context of examples once we get down to some discussion about the big questions. And this, I think, would have some strong and exciting linkages with your earlier comments, Georgina, for example.
Okay, so we have planned 3 more questions that are really designed to be sort of like a point of entry to help people onboard to this area of scholarship. And then 2 questions that are like, who even cares? This is so nerdy and so theoretical. Like, is there any application to this of relevance to the world that we should care about? I'm particularly attached to those last 2 questions. So this is the first time I'm doing the Zoom webinar format, and it's really weird that like our dearest friends and collaborators are sort of like behind this glass. Like first it was Yana, and now Raul is asking us this question, and like I guess I'm gonna read it, but we all know Raul is there. Hey Raul. So I think Raul's question is a great one to kind of like wrap up these 3 point of entry questions. So we have 37 minutes left, right? Okay. So if nobody else asks a question but Raul, then I should stretch out these last 5 questions. But if other people are going to ask questions, then I will speed them up. So I'll be waiting to hear from you in the chat box. What I should, Layla might ask a question. Way to keep it mysterious, Layla, from behind the one-way mirror. Okay, so we will head into the kind of like the first point of entry question that we have, which is hopefully briefly, tell us what got you interested in moral economies and water insecurity and why, and like, can you briefly trace an intellectual heritage that gets us into the work you're doing, and how is that disciplinary or not? Continuing with maybe we'll switch it up and go to Melissa first.
Okay. Oh gosh, okay, well I thought that this was a really hard question, Amber, because there's so many things that I'm interested about, and it was hard for me to like pinpoint an exact, give like a brief answer to this. I was introduced to the concept of moral economies by reading James Scott and E.P. Thompson in grad school, as I think a lot of people were, and as we all are in grad school, we're introduced to like all of these concepts, and we're like, oh my gosh, and you kind of write your papers and you move on. So it was really reading Amber's moral economy of water sharing paper in Bolivia that kind of brought the concept to my attention. And I was kind of like, oh yeah, I learned about this in grad school. And so as Amber described at the beginning, the intellectual heritage there was, E.P. Thompson kind of is credited with coining the term moral economy and kind of this model, operationalizing this model of moral economy that we've been talking about. And his writing is so rich, and I think there's so many ways that you could apply this concept based on his writing. And he was a Marxist cultural historian. And so he was writing about the ways that 18th century English peasant economies, grain markets, so the markets for grain were regulated according to moral economy models. So he really was using the moral economy concept as it applies to regulating markets. And he was kind of interested in these shifts in markets and what that meant culturally, and these cultural changes that were happening at the same time as the ideas of markets were shifting in English society. So James Scott then used this concept to apply it to Southeast Asian peasant communities in the 20th century. James Scott spoke about moral economies he talked about ways that peasants would share food with one another, right, to uphold this subsistence ethos. So it was less about regulating markets, and a lot of the actions that were happening were these reciprocal sharing practices among peasants. And that was really taken up by anthropologists, because economic anthropologists have a very long tradition of writing about reciprocal sharing economies. And that's kind of the tradition that led into Amber and Paul Trawick's work. And so it was reading about that and how it was applied to water that got me really interested. But then it was going into our water vendor paper that kind of the light bulb hit about this being a market-based practice, and that Scott's work is brilliant and wonderful. And that was kind of the basis for a lot of anthropological work on it. But that really E.P. Thompson's writing about markets to me was more useful to start thinking through what these market-based institutions and moral economies might look like. So I feel like that was a very convoluted answer. The bottom line is that I think that moral economies is an inherently interdisciplinary concept. It has come through anthropology very much because there's such a strong emphasis within anthropology and reciprocity. But I mean, we went from a historian to a political scientist to anthropologist that's been used by institutional economists. I think that we can't understand the full implications of it without drawing on multiple disciplines.
Thanks. Gina?
Great. Well, once again, Melissa, that was incredibly articulate. So thank you for those comments. For me, James Scott's work on the moral economy of the peasant was extremely influential. I kept going back to that when working and reworking the article I was mentioning. And I'd also had a chance to interact with him at Yale and also at University of Adelaide when he came here for one of our anthropology conferences in Australia. In the back of my mind, Karl Polanyi's work was also influential in terms of his thinking about the role of society and creating the kinds of economic systems that have developed over time and of the need for social protections in our market systems. And of course, Amber's piece it's all a decade ago, Amber, congratulations, on the moral economy of water re-examined in the Journal of Anthropological Research, which I still think is a definitive text. And I read it and took it as on great authority that your version of the moral economy was correct. In addition, I was part of a special issue for the same journal that I mentioned earlier, South Asia, in 2017, that had 2 submissions applying the moral economy to resource struggles in India. So one was Kuntala Lahiri Dutt's Resources and the Politics of Sovereignty, which is on the moral and immoral economies of coal mining in India. And another was by Siddharth Sareen on discourses around logging, the moral economy of wood extraction from West Singhbum's conflicted forests. So I just want to, I'm thinking aloud here, I have more to say, but I just want to say it's interesting that some of these references for me are popping up in area studies journals, perhaps as much or more than in theory-based journals or disciplinary rubber stamping journals. I think there might be something about how contested this term is and why people are having a little bit more of a free pass to talk about it within regional context, because within regional context, it makes perfect sense. But perhaps at a theoretical level, there's more gatekeeping or there's more citational performance that is perhaps net required. So that's another sidebar for us to potentially follow up. But for me, in terms of the way that I was thinking about moral economies, I was also influenced by a variety of justice-oriented work in social movement studies, particularly the branches of work that take seriously the knowledge production practices of social movement actors. So this, you know, in my PhD program, which was moons ago, I was part of a social movement working group. And then when I started my research in India, I was really focused on social movements. And social movements themselves are interdisciplinary. It combines work from anthropology, sociology, cultural geography, political science, and even cultural studies. And I'm probably missing out a few disciplines, history, that really engage with social movement studies, gender studies, feminist work, etc. I was also really influenced by regional work in South Asia. And I think I have to say this, I'm tentative to say this, but some of the work in South Asia has included positive nods towards the moralizing work of Mohandas Gandhi, which is just a little bit of a minefield. So I must say that, however, that an uncritical invocation of Gandhian ideals is currently not fashionable in the region and publishing in the region, South Asian studies, given his high caste status, some of his questionable actions during his life when it came to gender relations and sexual conduct, and also due to concerns for the personality cult that has developed around him that can at times be utilized and leveraged for Hindu nationalists. Gandhi himself, however, was also influenced by the ethics and morals of Henry Thoreau and Leo Tolstoy, along with his much cherished Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita. So one also has to take some of that into account when understanding the legacy that he's left in India, which is a legacy that's inspired many left-leaning and right-leaning activists alike, who are charged with kind of this moral ethos that Gandhi kind of set forward as a hallmark. So all of this is to say is that a moral economy framework has to be interdisciplinary. I can't see any other way, to be quite frank. If I have time, I'd also like to share some of the ways that I've come to understand and appreciate moral economy based on a song or two that the activists have provided for me and for the world to share their viewpoint. Do I have time to go into that, Amber?
Are you going to sing?
No, I'm not going to sing. Dear God, no. Although,
all right, I guess you can still share it.
For the first time ever, the journal that I just published in allowed me to have audio files. So if you're interested in hearing the activists singing these songs themselves in Hindi, you can go to the journal, you can go to the main webpage for the article, and you can click on the audio files. You can hear the original, some pieces of original interviews and some pieces of original songs. So I want to share a song because I think that as an anthropologist, if we're trying to understand where moral economies matter, and to invoke Raoul's question around, are they normative or are they explanatory? For me right now, this is more explanatory. The normative question I'll leave to the theory wonks in the room, which are, Melissa, Dustin, and Amber. But so for me, this is a formative explanation. So one of their songs, so I said I went to a lot of rallies and activist programs where they would kind of get together, and this is very common in social movements in India. There's a lot of singing and chanting, and that's how they convey their message. Also, there's in low-income areas, there's a lot of people who don't formally read or write. So this is one of the ways that they can participate and share knowledge within regions, and they can go around in villages and teach people songs that those people then teach others. So it is a type of social movement practice that's really influential. So I'm gonna speak to I'm gonna give a translation of, which is my own. I've had it vetted by someone who speaks Hindi as their mother tongue, but if there's any errors, it's my own, and you can look up the original Hindi text. And when I'm saying this, it lacks some of the power that it has when it's performed to tabla drums with a huge accompaniment, but here's my rendition. So imagine you're at a rally, a campaign in Mediganj, India, and there's a chorus of people, a crowd of people screaming, shouting, singing this song. And so here's the translation. Look, brother, the Americans are here. Japan's blood on their hands, the Americans are here. Bringing their bombs and guns, they've rested their filthy feet on Mother India's chest. Look, brother, the Americans are here. And then they go into a refrain. It was our water, it was our sugar, it was our labor, our blood and sweat. Into this, Coca-Cola added a little bit of the poison and reduced the water level. They chased out our lemon water, coconut water, and cane juice. And then there's another refrain that they sometimes mash up from a different song, which says, "Doodh dahi ke desh mein Coca-Cola nahi chalega," which means in the land of milk and yogurt, Coca-Cola doesn't work. We don't want it. So these are some of the ways that they keep shouting, and you'll hear that again and again. "Doodh dahi ke desh mein Coca-Cola nahi chalega." So, and it's catchy, and regionally, it really has a lot of purchase. So to me, there are clear moral economy elements to this discourse, including claims about the loss of subsistence strategies that the villagers have suffered, right? They chased out our lemon water, our coconut water, our cane juice. These were all kind of cottage industries, to use a Gandhian term. These were small scale industries that people earned money that helped them live day to day, and they became unviable once Coca-Cola was available to them. And initially Coca-Cola made these very small bottles that were really affordable for 5 rupees when they were basically trying to get people hooked, because people were used to drinking these other more historically resonant sources. So I think the references to the land and soil poisonings, along with the reminder of America's nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also cast further the situation that the Mediganj villagers confronted in a kind of moral order of David versus Goliath, or to put it in regional terms, and invoke the Ramayana, Ram versus Ravana. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Dustin.
These are amazing acts to follow. Let me just start with the reflection that if there were a field study, a field exam on moral economies, I would not have passed, even despite my dabbling and reading in the space and my cramming for this particular session. And I want to give a shout out to Katie, who's on the line, and to have a collective laugh of sitting in seminars at Arizona 15 years ago, thinking that I would be on the panel on moral economies, talking with these eminent anthropologists. And what I can offer to this discussion is a few of the points that in seminal works that have guided me in these early stages of this discussion around the kind of premise or the observation that it is not the people that make markets through their selfish interactions in pursuit of material gains, but it's the markets that remake the people and can lead them to respond to those types of incentives. So my interest in this topic around moral economies and some of the cognate discussions has been motivated by the people who are working to understand the process through which markets remake environmental subjects. So it won't surprise you to start with recognizing Arun Agrawal's work on environmentality and the creation of environmental subjects in the face of these types of material incentives. Continuing, on, of course, recognizing the body of work from Eleanor Ostrom, Juan Camilo Cardenas, and other colleagues who kind of demonstrating that, in fact, people have these other regarding preferences and concerns for, ethical and moral positions around fairness, justice, and so forth, and demonstrating the obvious through a set of work, which has now been considered to be increasingly recognized within the quote unquote mainstream of the economic discipline. And despite that work, I think that there is still an uneasy relationship between the moral economy as we're discussing it today and the discussion of material incentives. And so the work by Samuel Bowles, who I've referenced a few times, particularly his 1998 review in the Journal of Economic Literature on endogenous preferences, was really eye-opening for me because it showed the mechanisms or processes through which markets remake people and can potentially crowd out these other regarding preferences. And then in terms of going forward, I have been inspired by people like Joseph Henrich and others within a group which I've now learned has been described as the Norms and Preferences Network, and formed in the 1990s to try to develop a cross-cultural and comparative network across 15 societies, looking at questions including the impacts of market integration on different measures of pro-sociality. And Joseph Henrich and colleagues' work has been quite influential for me as I look at how we would design a research program to more systematically and longitudinally assess the evolution of markets and pro-sociality. The last thing that I would like to mention is to kind of frame the literature on moral economy in relation to some other kind of touchstones in the fields of political theory, of institutional theory, and so forth. I wanted to refer to the concept of fractious holism as a way of understanding how the moral economy and these material incentives coexist. And political theorist Jane Bennett described fractious holism in trying to consider nature, human relations, but it's been applied by Lee Raymond, I don't know if that shows up correctly, in his work examining equity considerations in market-based environmental policy, where describes this relationship here applied to the relationship between the moral economy and material incentives as holistic in the sense that they are increasingly in a kind of globalized society inextricably linked and inseparable, but that fractious in the sense that they are often but not always working in or defined by opposition to one another, where material incentives can crowd out moral or ethical concerns, or where the latter can drive resistance to processes of commodification or other market processes. And so I think that this concept of fractious holism may be useful for us as we try to position these debates around moral economy within these rich traditions of anthropology and other disciplinary areas like history and the others that were referenced, with the kind of center of gravity on discussions around norms, pro-sociality, other regarding preferences in these other domains. And I think that's where I can engage and hopefully contribute to the immense learning and collaboration that we have an opportunity to do.
Thank you so much. Okay, So now what we're going to do is we'll turn to Raul's question, and then we're going to do a rapid fire round in which I will ask you the next 2 questions with 1-sentence answers only, and then we'll get to the last 2 if we don't get any more questions. Okay, so I'm giving you, a couple of minutes to cope with the fact that I'm going to ask for a 1-sentence answer to the next. Okay, so to read Raul's question, he begins by saying how fabulous we are. I will not read that part, but I will carry it in my heart forever. And so he says, I will manifest a substantive uneasiness with the term of moral economy as something as inherently positive. If I understood correctly how you all understand moral economies, it would appear as though a moral economy is an analytical framework that presupposes there will be well-being for everyone who shares a good within the system of mutual exchanges. However, if I understood Amber correctly, this does not happen in all cases. In Xochimilco, Mexico City, there is water sharing that actually benefits both loaner and loan recipients. One of my PhD students, now graduated, found that women shared and exchanged or loaned water across households, a phenomenon that I had not seen documented in Mexico ever before. This is a case of positive moral economy, but if I understood correctly your comments, particularly Melissa's, moral economies can be balanced and unbalanced, thus having negative and positive effects. So the question is the notion of a moral economy a normative framework, a goal to achieve, or an explanatory one? In the case of my PhD student, it would appear as though moral economy explains why women share water across households in Xochimilco. Would love to hear your take on this. Who feels able to take it?
I'll jump in.
I've already given my pass, just so I'm out. I've already said my 2 bits on this. Go ahead, Melissa.
Raul, this is an awesome question. Thank you. And I think, so there's like a few questions packed in there. So I want to answer this first one, which gets back to what Gina said at the very beginning, which is something that a moral economy is not necessarily this like utopian idea that everybody gets, an equal amount of everything. Fundamentally, moral economies, as they were explained by Thompson and Scott, involve conflict, right? And it's about the level to which people accept inequality within their community, as long as their basic right to subsistence and life is being met. So basically, there's like a threshold to which people will accept inequality and even in, inequality and equity. There's a level to which people will accept inequality. And once that level is tripped, right, there's like a tipping point to where it's not acceptable anymore. And that's where you see conflict and social unrest. So that's where moral economies can be. That's why I'm saying E.P. Thompson's writing is so rich, because you can look at it as an explanatory framework for understanding why people, when and why people share the resources that they do or regulate markets in the way that they do. But it can also be what's the word that you use, right? It could also be a goal to achieve in saying that we want to have an economy in which everybody's sense of justice, right, is at a minimal level, is minimally met, right? And so, I think that, but it can also be viewed as kind of, and this is where James Scott as a political scientist was interested in this, is that he was interested at like, what are those tipping points of social unrest? Like, what are those points at which society is saying like, no, we're not going to accept that, right? And he explained moral economy as a way to understand that there's like collective moral sense of a basic subsistence. And when that's violated, we see conflict. So you can see the political scientist or the political science, aspect to the theory there. Does that answer the question? I don't know if I really answered it adequately.
Does anybody else want to join in?
Okay, Raul said it does.
Thanks, Raul. Okay, if not, then here comes the rapid fire round. Just a reminder for the next 2 questions, these are 1-sentence answers only. Here we go. The first question is, imagine a semi-rural or peri-urban community with significant water insecurity that depends on groundwater, surface water, and water vendors. If a moral economy is present, please share a prediction that you would have about what we could observe in this community. Who's ready? Melissa, you're used to me torturing you constantly, so I'm just gonna call on you.
I mean, I have multiple, you just want me to share one prediction though, because I get one sentence, right?
If you could do it 3 in 3 sentences, that's also going to be permissible.
Okay. Well, a prediction about the community is that there is going to be a sense, like a basic agreement, a sense of justice, right, within the community that you're going to be able to find out generally ethnographically, right? I would say that rarely is this sense of justice like codified in some sort of legal document. Sorry, I'm off. I'm 2 sentences.
You have any more?
Oh, I get another sentence, but it has to be a different thing.
You have one more sentence. I'll come back to you. Gina, let's go.
All right, so I would predict that if a moral economy was present, water pricing would come up frequently, and that the claims that might arise would seek a fair and affordable price for good quality water. Quality water is extremely important to this scenario, even if water overall is not evenly distributed.
Dustin?
I would predict that the water vendors, if there is a moral economy, would donate water to the poorest to maintain their social license to operate, if not their commitment to their fellow community members, unless the vending is driven by outside vendors who lack that connection to the community. And we've been observing that in some of our sites.
3 sweet hypotheses that anyone can falsify. All right, anybody have anything else to add?
I'll just say that I think it's really important to remember that there could be a variety of property rights within the community happening. So you said groundwater, surface water, water vendors. Moral economies can exist. There could be communal property rights. It could be individual private property rights. There could be a variety of property rights operating. And I think that's important to remember.
Excellent. Okay, next rapid round question. 1 sentence answer only. Actually, it's a 1 question answer only. What is the most important or exciting novel research question to you about moral economy and water insecurity? Melissa, into the torture chamber, go.
To me, I think it's how they nest or scale up. So at what point do moral economies, at what level do they operate, and do they start breaking down, and why?
Gina.
Great, I have a similar comment. So I would say that moral economies tend to pop up when looking at the local level. And as we expand out, we begin to speak more of political economies, resource politics, and geopolitics. But I wonder, however, how a moral economy framework to some of these macro level contestations might apply, and what they might allow scholars to reveal and to argue. And that is kind of sort of my response to Cassandra's question or comment on the side as well.
You want to go ahead and let people know what that question is and answer it?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Cassandra Workman says, just out of curiosity and not a high level question, is anyone who is working on this in the US regarding the recent policy of water cutoffs in light of COVID, ? It just seems so prime for social science exploration. I assume someone is doing this. I would just be interested in reading it. So I think that's already implying not just the local level social movement in a village, but when we expand out to more writ large policy issues.
Thank you. All right, so last from Dustin, the most important or exciting research question, rapid fire.
I will build off of the 2 comments around the issue of scaling, and I will ask, what are the role of group level or collectively managed property rights in mediating market pressures and their impacts on the moral economy, or in my terms, the long-term effects of that market integration on pro-sociality?
Thank you. So Erin O'Donnell has a question. I'm going to ask you all to read and reflect on it while we move to the next question on our list. So now we are at the questions about the applied implications, which I think were all those questions teed up really nicely. So let's delve a little more deeply into this. The first one is, what are the implications of moral economies for people doing applied work to address water insecurity? We're going to be mindful of the fact that we probably don't have more than 1 minute each for each person to get through these 2 questions plus Erin's. Gina, since your work really engages this quite directly, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Well, I had already edited down my response to one sentence, so now I'll add back in. For the record, if anyone's reading this or watching this later on, some of my comments were prepared because I got up early for this. So I didn't want to be umming my way through an early morning sunrise with all these esteemed colleagues. But I think in terms of when it comes to applied work, the kinds of discourses and actions that we might equate with a moral economy can quite simply help to shut down misbehaving companies, industries, municipalities, governments. I think that's incredibly applied. So I might have said it, I might have skipped over it, but the movement in Mediganj was successful in 2014 in shutting down the Coca-Cola factory in Mediganj. Now, the official line is that the Pollution Control Board shut it down because they were found to have over-extracted water beyond what their allocation was. And there were some questionable concerns around whether or not they had perhaps also occupied panchayat or village level communal land in the setting up of their factory and their operations. But when I speak to my colleagues, my activist friends in Mediganj, they would say, look, governments don't just take actions willy-nilly. How many companies are there in the world, industries in the world, that over-extract water? And since they're only paying a few rupees a liter or less than that, they look the other way. They're paid, they're bribed to look the other way as well. There's corruption issues. So the fact that a Pollution Control Board took action, they are saying is the result of their 10 plus years of moving and rallying and raising awareness around this issue, trying to get people concerned, and that this is kind of a face-saving measure that is, if you look behind it, the victors are the social movement activists. So I think that is why we might think of this in terms of the applied work that it can go on to do. And hopefully we've also seen, if I can just add, we've seen a huge movement around the world for more responsible behavior on the part of big names like Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. They now have a lot of their bottled water and on their main iconic branding beverages like Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola, they have a discourse around sustainability, around a zero water balance, or having a blue tick of recharging water in various parts of India or wherever they're operating. So there has been social pressure that has increased the sustainability, or at least the blue washing or the green washing of their sustainability discourse, but hopefully also actually their practices around the world.
Thank you. Melissa, who cares?
I think that this gets back to what you said at the beginning of the session, Amber. The reality is that to address water insecurity in the coming years, we are going to increasingly have to rely on small scale solutions and locally based solutions. And that includes relying on water vendors and local and water markets. So I think that being able to understand the elements that can make a moral economy, that enable people to uphold their sense of justice within local water economies, and how they can build local water economies to uphold that notion of justice and hold the people who are selling the water accountable to that, is really important, because as so many of our HWISE colleagues' work has shown, that when people's sense of justice is undermined within water economies, it has severe consequences for emotional health and well-being. So I think that when economies are viewed as not just, people are distressed. And a lot of your work has shown that, Amber, Cassie's work, so many people who are here, their work has shown that. So I think that is an inherently applied contribution of the moral economy framework.
Thank you. Dustin, applied
because my hubris knows no bounds, the applied insights would be that we need to design incentives and markets as if people cared about each other rather than are purely selfish. And I can tell you from my discussions as the Trojan horse and discussions around market design, that the assumptions about rationality, about selfishness are stubborn. And the developments of markets, or in the case of informal vendors, the empowerment of informal and small scale solutions can really come from accounting for these other guarding preferences in designing these markets or strengthening them or addressing their faults in a way that nourishes and bolsters the sense of justice that we're able to learn from the moral economies model.
Thank you. Very well pitched, everyone. We're going back to one sentence answers so that we can hit these two questions we've gotten plus our last question. So the first one is from Aaron O'Donnell. Does the moral economy framework have a particular role to play in settler colonial societies as a way to build a bridge between indigenous economic frameworks and settler state markets? Can anyone give a quick one-ish sentence answer to that extremely large question?
I'll try. It's a really big question and it's a really good question. And I can't do this in one sentence, Amber, sorry. I'm gonna be as brief as possible. One of my, coming into the session today, I was really uneasy with the fact that so many of the scholars that we're mentioning from Thompson and Scott, like Thompson and Scott are still old white men. And so I think that it's really important to remember that although the moral economy model may have been operationalized by these old white men, the concept of, a subsistence ethic and a moral understanding of, treating one another with dignity and respect and ensuring that we all have a right to live is seen in every thread of Indigenous scholarship, in Black feminist writing, in critical race theory, right? So they may not be calling it moral economy, but those are threads that, are articulating with the way that people may be using that moral economy model. I don't know if I articulated that well, or if that hits, the answer that you're looking for, Aaron, but I think that it's really important for us to be thinking through how those threads of scholarship should be engaging with one another.
Gina or Dustin, do you want to follow on to that answer at all?
Well, I'll just say that I'm sitting on Kaurna land, unceded Kaurna land in Adelaide, South Australia. So I do want to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging here. And I also want to note that in the context of Australia, we've had a budding movement for native title rights. And this has been very prominent. It was a change to the legal status. So people can go and they can define and assert that they have a longstanding claim to land based on cultural practices, secret women's business, secret men's business, etc. But however, we don't have a native title that responds to water rights, Indigenous water rights. So I think that there are elements of a moral economy framework in terms of some of the discourses, knowledge practices, and collective action that could arise around this issue that we could see helping to change the legal framework so that Aboriginal and Indigenous populations in countries like Australia could start to have actual claims over water, not just territories. And a lot of the territories that they're given claims to through native title often don't end up having a lot of water on those lands.
Thank you. Justin Stoller asked a question that I think we've given our best answers to already, and I really just want to read to highlight that I think it's a future research question that a lot could be done around, which is, given water's physicality, how do we think place and space shape the emergence of moral economies of water? Have people studied the regionalization of moral economies of water? So I think we've given some answers to that, but also it's a great research question moving forward. So now, just to wrap up with our final one sentence answers, moral economies is a tricky and difficult theoretical concept, as evidenced by this conversation, and one that's highly contested across theoretical perspectives. Why should our colleagues who work in water insecurity in universities and in the applied sector care about moral economies? Who's ready to go first?
I'll go. Okay. My one sentence response gets back to something that I already said. I think that a lot of water insecurity scholars, a lot of water scholars, and a lot of people in the applied sector are fundamentally interested in building water systems that uphold justice and that people view to be fair and just. And as we explained at the beginning, there's a lot of ways to kind of build justice from a top-down model, like the human right to water, but moral economies is a concept that allows us to understand and listen to notions of justice from the ground up.
Thank you. Gina.
Great, so we're on the last question? Okay, so I think we should care because the people we work with and people we should be working with care about equity and subsistence. Many of the people with whom we might choose to speak with during our research will evoke something akin to a moral economy framework when critiquing imbalanced or unjust water use practices. So there are times when it makes sense to layer those concerns perhaps into a cultural politics or a political ecology framework, but there are also times when the urgency of the social solidarity or the calls for social solidarity or the calls for an alternative social order, citation Wutich 2011 and citation. So when they're calling for these things, if we overlook those frameworks and the kind of the ground-based level up knowledge practices, then I think we're missing an opportunity to really engage with what matters to people, why, and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Gina, just to put kind of like a sharper point on Gina's work, I think her work is so important because what it does is it shows us that moral economies give us a blueprint for social movements to fight against injustice in the water sector. And that is an incredibly important contribution in my view.
Any durable progress will depend on accounting for moral economies and the quote unquote solutions that have attempted to kind of tap into material incentives without accounting for people's morality and ethical concerns have proven fleeting and usually counterproductive. And I've seen that by tracking a number of experiences with markets and collaborative and other types of approaches, which crowd out our concern for each other.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for really opening up a landscape on a very challenging topic. And thank you to our participants for sticking with us through this. It has been such a pleasure to be here with you. We appreciate you being on this journey with us.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this and for inviting us.